Doug Weiss and Lisa Weiss had spent 30 years building a life together, bound by shared faith, family, and the very values that Doug spent his career preaching to others. From the outside, their marriage appeared solid, a partnership built on trust and devotion, with Doug frequently using their relationship as an example of commitment in his counseling work. But behind closed doors, cracks had been forming for years, cracks that Lisa would later describe as small moments of distance that slowly widened into something irreparable. Lisa wasn't sure when it began, but she could feel Doug pulling away. He wasn't as present as he once had been, not just physically but emotionally. Conversations grew shorter. His attention seemed elsewhere, and the warmth that had once defined their marriage had turned into something more transactional. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't about fights, betrayals, or sudden revelations. Instead, it was a quiet unraveling, the slow realization that the man she had spent decades with was no longer fully there. Lisa later admitted that she had hoped it was just a phase, something that could be fixed with time and effort. After all, marriage wasn't supposed to be easy. She had heard Doug say it himself in countless sermons, books, and counseling sessions. But the more she tried to bridge the growing gap, the more distant he seemed to become. Doug, always consumed by his work, had grown even more focused on his career in recent years. His schedule was relentless, filled with speaking engagements, counseling sessions, and new projects. Lisa supported him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had become secondary to everything else in his life. She had spent years being his partner, his support system, but now she felt more like an afterthought. And then, one day it was over. Doug, the man who had spent his life telling others that marriage required endurance and unwavering commitment, walked away. For Lisa, the divorce wasn't just heartbreaking, it was disorienting. How had they gone from being a couple who had built a life together, raised a family, and stood side by side in ministry, strangers moving in separate directions? There had been no major incident, no single moment that defined their downfall. Instead, it had been a slow erosion, and by the time Doug made his decision, she realized she had been the only one still trying to hold on. What made it even harder to accept was the speed at which he seemed to move on. While Lisa was left to process the end of their marriage, Doug seemed ready to start a new chapter almost immediately. It didn't feel like grief or reflection, it felt like a man who had already made peace with his decision long before the papers were signed. Lisa began to wonder if Doug had emotionally left the marriage long before he physically did. If his heart had already found a new direction, while she was still fighting for what they had built. The pain of their separation wasn't just personal, it was public. Doug had built his reputation on the foundation of strong marriages, and now, the very principles he had preached were crumbling in his own life. Lisa, who had been by his side for decades, was suddenly left with questions she never thought she'd have to ask. Had their life together truly meant as much to him as it had to her? Had she misread the signs? Or had Doug already been preparing to leave long before she knew their marriage was in trouble? When Doug's relationship with Joni Lamb became public knowledge so soon after their divorce, those questions became even harder to ignore. Lisa wasn't naive, she knew that people moved on at different speeds, but the timeline felt too abrupt, too unnatural. Had there been something between Doug and Joni before the divorce? Had Lisa been left behind while Doug was already looking toward a different future? She didn't have the answers, but the weight of those questions lingered. What hurt the most wasn't just losing Doug, it was the erasure of everything they had shared. 30 years of memories, sacrifices, and love seemed to disappear overnight. It was as if their past had been rewritten, as if their marriage had never truly mattered to him. Lisa was left with only the echoes of a life she thought was forever, while Doug had already stepped into something new without looking back. Doug Weiss built his career on the foundation of unwavering commitment to marriage, preaching that divorce was never an option for Christian couples. He authored books, gave passionate speeches, and counseled countless men and women on the principles of faith, love, and loyalty. He often emphasized that a godly marriage required endurance, patience, and the firm belief that no matter the struggles, divorce should never be considered. His own marriage to Lisa Weiss was used as an example of this philosophy, a testament to the idea that couples could overcome any challenge with faith. But when Doug himself ended his 30-year marriage and remarried within months, everything he had stood for was suddenly called into question. The contradictions in his messaging became even more apparent when old social media posts and articles resurfaced, revealing the depth of his past convictions. In one Facebook post, he made a bold declaration, stating that he and Lisa had long decided that murder was an option, but divorce never. It was meant as a dramatic way of expressing commitment, a phrase that many of his followers found humorous but powerful at the time. It painted a picture of a man who was deeply dedicated to his marriage, someone who would fight to the end to preserve the sacred bond between husband and wife. And yet, not long after making such a firm proclamation, he walked away from the very commitment he had so passionately defended. Even more revealing was a 2017 article in which Doug doubled down on the role of a husband in protecting his wife. He instructed men to aggressively attack any accusations made against their spouse, claiming that even if they were 1% true, they should be treated as lies. His words suggested an almost militant defense of marriage, an insistence that doubt, criticism, or hardship should never be entertained. But when it came to his own marriage, Doug failed to follow his own teachings. Rather than defending Lisa, fighting for their relationship, or practicing the endurance he had preached, he instead distanced himself and ultimately chose to leave. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. Many of those who had followed his work and taken his advice to heart felt betrayed. How could a man who had built his entire reputation on the permanence of marriage so quickly abandon his own? Had his words ever been sincere, or had they merely been a crafted image to sell books and attract followers? The situation raised an uncomfortable question. Was Doug Weiss truly a believer in his own philosophy? Or had he been performing a role that he himself no longer believed in? The swiftness of his remarriage to Joni Lamb only deepened the controversy. To those who had trusted his teachings, the timeline felt almost surreal. Just months after divorcing the woman he once called his soulmate, he was standing at the altar with someone else. A public display that all but erased the convictions he had spent decades promoting. The ease with which he transitioned from one marriage to another made it difficult for people to reconcile the man he had presented himself to be with the man he had become. For Lisa, the contradiction was even more painful. She had spent 30 years as the wife of a man who told others that marriage was for life, that commitment was not just a word but a promise. She had trusted in that message, believed in it, and lived according to the principles he had shared with the world. And yet, when her own marriage faced challenges, instead of demonstrating the endurance he had urged others to practice, Doug simply walked away. His silence on the matter only fueled speculation. Instead of addressing the contradictions head-on, Doug chose to avoid public discussions about his divorce. He never explained why his views had seemingly shifted so drastically, never clarified why the principles he had preached no longer applied to his own life. His reluctance to speak on the subject left his followers with no closure, forcing them to draw their own conclusions about what had really happened. The fallout from this contradiction extended beyond Doug himself. His credibility as a marriage counselor took a major hit, with many questioning whether his advice could still be trusted. If he had failed to uphold his own teachings, how could he continue guiding others? The backlash was not just about his personal choices, it was about the integrity of his entire career. For many, Doug Weiss was no longer the unwavering figure of faith and commitment he had once claimed to be. Instead, he had become the very thing he had warned against, a man who abandoned his vows when things became too difficult. Doug Weiss's remarriage to Joni Lamb wasn't just unexpected, it was uncomfortably fast. Within months of finalizing his divorce from Lisa Weiss, he was standing beside Joni at the altar, exchanging vows that seemed to erase 3 decades of his previous marriage. To those watching from the outside, it felt less like a natural transition and more like a pre-planned move, a relationship that had already been in motion before his divorce was official. The timing raised unsettling questions. Had Doug emotionally checked out of his marriage long before he left? Had his connection with Joni begun while he was still with Lisa? And why was there such urgency in making this new union public? For years, Doug and Joni had occupied the same Christian circles, both well-known figures in faith-based media and counseling. Their paths had crossed multiple times, working together on projects that blended ministry and personal development. This wasn't just a sudden romance between two strangers, it was a relationship with a past, a history that many believed may have gone deeper than they initially let on. The fact that Doug, who had once championed the idea of lifelong commitment, moved on so quickly after ending his marriage, only added to the speculation. Lisa, still reeling from the collapse of her marriage, was blindsided by how fast everything unfolded. One moment she was grieving the loss of a husband she had spent 30 years with, and the next, she was watching him publicly celebrate a new chapter with another woman. There was no period of reflection, no visible sign of Doug processing the end of his previous life. It was as if he had simply closed one door and immediately stepped through another, leaving Lisa in the past without hesitation. The speed of it all made her wonder if she had ever really known the man she had been married to. For the Christian community, the optics of the situation were troubling. Doug had spent his career teaching couples about patience, healing, and the importance of working through difficulties. Yet his own actions told a different story, one of abandonment. and a rushed new beginning that left little room for the principles he had preached. If he had truly believed in the sanctity of marriage, why did he seem so eager to move on without a moment of hesitation? The suddenness of his remarriage didn't just damage his personal credibility, it also cast a shadow over Daystar, where Joni had spent years promoting values of faith, integrity, and family. Rumors soon began swirling that Doug and Joni's relationship hadn't started after his divorce, but much earlier. Whispers within the faith community suggested that there had been an emotional connection long before his marriage ended, that perhaps Doug's growing distance from Lisa had coincided with a deepening bond with Joni. While there was no definitive proof, the timeline itself was enough to make people question whether his decision to leave Lisa had been truly about personal struggles or if he had already set his sights on a different future. Even more concerning was the way Joni and Doug seemed to control the narrative. Instead of addressing the speculation head-on, they presented their relationship as something pure, a love story that had blossomed in the wake of loss. But the speed at which they married made it difficult for people to buy into that version of events. A grieving widow and a newly divorced man rushing into marriage didn't feel like a story of healing, it felt like a carefully orchestrated transition. And when Joni took steps to remove content from Daystar that painted her or Doug's ex-wife, Lisa, in a negative light, it only fueled suspicions that there was more to the story than they were willing to admit. For Lisa, the pain of seeing her ex-husband move on so quickly was compounded by the way their history had been dismissed. She wasn't expecting him to remain alone forever, but she hadn't anticipated being replaced with such speed and finality. It wasn't just the loss of a marriage, it was the realization that Doug had already stepped into a new life, as if their past had never mattered. In the end, Doug and Joni's whirlwind remarriage left more questions than answers. Was this truly a relationship built on love? Or had it been forming long before the public knew? Had Doug truly grieved the end of his marriage? Or had he simply been waiting for the moment he could move forward? And for a man who had spent his life preaching about patience, commitment, and faith, how did he justify a decision that seemed to contradict everything he once stood for? The answers remained unclear, but for many the damage to his reputation was already done. Lisa Weiss never imagined that after 30 years of marriage, she would suddenly find herself cast aside, watching the man she had built a life with step into a new chapter with shocking speed. The pain of losing her husband was one thing, but the way it happened, the abruptness, the lack of explanation, the feeling that she had been discarded for someone else was something she struggled to comprehend. Unlike Doug, who remained mostly silent about their divorce, Lisa found herself forced to process her grief publicly, as whispers and speculation about their split turned into a full-blown scandal within the Christian community. For Lisa, the hardest part wasn't just the end of the marriage itself, but the way it made her question everything she had believed about her relationship with Doug. She had spent decades by his side, not only as his wife but as his partner in ministry, supporting his work and trusting in the values he preached. He had assured her and the world that their marriage was built on faith, that commitment was more than just words, that they would stand together through any storm. And yet, when the cracks appeared, Doug didn't fight for their relationship. He walked away, and before she could even fully process what had happened, he was already married to someone else. Lisa's response to their divorce was marked by quiet dignity. She didn't lash out publicly or engage in bitter accusations, but she didn't stay silent either. In a heartfelt statement, she admitted that she had fought for their marriage, doing everything she could to salvage what they had built. She had believed in their commitment, in the promises they had made before God, and she had hoped that Doug, the man who had counseled so many others to stay and fight for love, would practice what he preached. But in the end, it was clear that his heart was elsewhere, and she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. What made the situation even more painful was the speed at which Doug seemed to erase their shared history. Just months after their divorce was finalized, he stood beside Joni Lamb, exchanging vows and stepping into a new life, as if the past 30 years had been nothing more than a stepping stone to something else. Lisa wasn't bitter about the fact that Doug had moved on. She had never expected him to remain single forever, but the speed at which he did it made her feel like she had been nothing more than an afterthought. How could someone claim to believe so deeply in the sanctity of marriage, only to replace his wife so effortlessly? Lisa later reflected on how difficult it was to grieve a marriage that, to the outside world, no longer seemed to matter. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out, offering support, but the truth was, she felt alone in her pain. Doug's public image remained intact, and Joni, a powerful figure in Christian broadcasting, had the influence to shape the narrative in a way that suited their new life together. Meanwhile, Lisa was left to navigate the heartbreak without the same platform or control over how their story was being told. Despite everything, Lisa refused to let bitterness define her. She admitted that while the pain was overwhelming, she also found strength in her faith, believing that even in loss there was a purpose. She leaned on close friends and family, trying to find peace in the midst of heartbreak. She acknowledged that there were good times in her marriage, that there had been love, laughter, and moments worth cherishing even if, in the end, it had all fallen apart. But she also knew she had to move forward, to rebuild a life that no longer revolved around the man who had left her behind. In many ways, Lisa's response stood in stark contrast to Doug's actions. While he moved on quickly, she took her time to heal. While he remained silent, she spoke her truth, not out of anger, but out of a need to be heard. Her pain resonated with many, especially those who had experienced similar betrayals. She became a symbol of resilience, proof that even after heartbreak, there was a way forward. And while Doug's reputation as a marriage counselor suffered under the weight of his own contradictions, Lisa emerged with her integrity intact. Lisa Weiss may not have been the one with the spotlight, but in the end she didn't need it. Her story, her pain, and her quiet strength spoke louder than any public statement ever could. The controversy surrounding Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb didn't just affect their personal reputations, it sent shockwaves through Daystar, the Christian television network Joni co-founded with her late husband, Marcus Lamb. For years, Daystar had been a trusted voice in faith-based broadcasting, promoting messages of family, commitment, and biblical values. But Joni's whirlwind marriage to Doug, coming so soon after both their divorces, created a credibility crisis that the network couldn't easily shake. Supporters of Daystar began questioning whether its leadership still upheld the principles it preached, or if personal scandals were now dictating its direction. The backlash was immediate and divisive. While some viewers defended Joni, believing she had found love after loss, others saw her actions as hypocritical, clashing with the moral standards Daystar had long promoted. Accusations of secrecy and manipulation only made things worse, particularly when it was revealed that Joni had taken steps to remove content that cast her or Doug's ex-wife, Lisa, in a negative light. Instead of addressing concerns head-on, Daystar seemed to be erasing uncomfortable narratives, fueling further suspicion about what was really happening behind the scenes. The most shocking fallout, however, was the decision to fire Joni's own son, Jonathan Lamb, from his leadership role at Daystar. Jonathan, who had been vocal in his disapproval of his mother's relationship with Doug, was abruptly removed from the organization, leading many to believe that personal conflicts were now interfering with professional decisions. His dismissal deepened the divide within the Lamb family and sent a troubling message to Daystar's audience. Was the network still a faith-based ministry, or had it become entangled in the personal ambitions of its leaders? As the controversy continued to unfold, Daystar faced a growing crisis of trust. What had once been a network dedicated to spreading Christian values was now at the center of a scandal that many felt contradicted everything it stood for. Whether Joni and Doug could restore faith in Daystar remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the network's legacy would never be the same. Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb's reputations may never fully recover from the scandal that followed their whirlwind marriage. What was once a story of respected Christian leaders has now become a tale of contradiction, secrecy, and personal ambition overshadowing faith. Doug, once admired as a trusted marriage counselor, now faces scrutiny from those who once sought his guidance. His teachings on commitment and loyalty ring hollow in the wake of his own actions, leaving many to question whether he ever truly believed in the principles he preached. Meanwhile, Joni's leadership at Daystar is no longer seen as a beacon of stability, but as a stage for personal drama that threatens the network's credibility. The unanswered questions surrounding their relationship only deepen the damage. Did Doug and Joni's connection begin before his divorce? Was his marriage to Lisa already emotionally over long before he walked away? And why was there such a rush to marry so soon after separating from their respective spouses? These lingering doubts make it difficult for many to trust the narrative they've presented. Instead of an inspiring love story, their relationship has become a cautionary tale, one that exposes the cracks within Christian leadership when personal choices conflict with public teachings. For Daystar, the long-term effects remain uncertain. Viewers who once supported the network are now divided, struggling to reconcile the values it claims to uphold with the actions of its leaders. The firing of Jonathan Lamb and the erasure of content critical of Joni and Doug only add to the growing sense that Daystar is more focused on controlling the narrative than maintaining transparency. Whether it can regain its credibility, or if the damage is irreversible, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the legacy of Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb has been permanently altered, and the questions surrounding their story may never fully be put to rest.